So let's talk about how we'll actually use these variables in our prototypes. We're still going to be dealing with the same four variables: Boolean, color, string, and number. But instead of using them in our libraries to power all of these different systems, we're actually just going to create local collections that we can then point to with our interactions in prototype mode. So in the files where I'm prototyping, I'll probably have an interactions collection like this. And if you're really doing a lot, maybe it makes sense to use separate collections. But honestly, most of the time I can get by with a single collection and just using groups to help me stay organized so that I can associate variables together. And then from there, we're going to prototype the exact same way that we normally would by adding these little interactions. Only the difference is we can add multiple interactions to a single click or hover event like this. And so with variables, you can start to string together these pieces of logic so that when an action is taken, like a button is clicked, we can actually trigger 4, 5, 6, 7 different things to happen inside of our prototypes. So let's walk through these steps that we're going to take every time that we're prototyping with variables. I set up a very, very simple prototype over here. My goal is just to show or hide this image when this button is clicked. So the first thing that we're going to do is we know that we're going to create a local variable. In this case, I either want to show or hide something. It's a simple yes, no. So our brain should automatically be thinking, okay, that's a Boolean. It's just a yes or no. So I'm going to go ahead and open up my local variables here. I'm going to go ahead and create a new collection just so that it's a little bit cleaner for this example. Then I can create a new variable. I'm going to select Boolean and I'll just call that is visible. And I'm going to go ahead and set this to true. And the way to think about this value column is this is the default state that you want your UI to take. So in this case, I've set it to true. So when I attach this variable to an element, it's going to be visible by default. And that same logic applies to all of the different types of prototypes that we're making. We create a variable and then we say, okay, what do I want the default UI to look like? I'm going to define that in this first column. Now, the second thing that we're going to do is bind our variable to our UI. And bind is just a fancy way to say attach or connect. In this case, we want to tell Figma that the visibility of this layer should be attached to the variable that we just created. Now, where you bind variables depends on the type of variable that you're trying to use. For something like visibility, all you have to do is come to this layer here, and then you can right click on the eye icon and attach it to the is visible Boolean. And the next step is we want to test our variable connection. Before getting lost into that prototyping window, we first need to make sure, is this set up correctly? And the easiest way to do that is open up our local variables and then just change the default value. Remember, we set it to true, which is why it's still showing. But if we turn this off, we would expect that it would disappear. Ta-da! And that's how we know that this is set up correctly. Once we have our variable bound correctly, then we can go into step 4, which is really where the meat of the prototyping happens. This is where we're going to set up our triggers and define all of the logic that is controlling our prototype. And here's how I think about the logic part specifically. Every single interaction that we're going to set up that uses variables is going to end by saying set variable, because this is ultimately what changes something in our UI. So we know we're going to end up at that point. The question is, can we jump straight there? In our case, we can. If the button is clicked, we want to hide the image and set that variable to false. But sometimes it's a bit more complex than that, because first we have to check to make sure that a condition is met. So in a second here, we're going to look at an example where we can only set the variable if a different variable equals 0. We still are going to end up setting the variable at the end of the day, but instead of clicking set variable in the interactions menu, we're going to click conditional and then use that to wrap around our set variable action down here. So at the end of the day, it's always going to end in set variable. You just might have to wrap your set variable action in a conditional action. If what I'm saying sounds a little bit like Portuguese and doesn't quite make sense yet, Don't worry, we're going to talk about this a lot over the upcoming lessons. For now, I'm just going to keep moving forward and let's finish up our simplistic example right here. So to start, all I want to do is just hide this image when this button is clicked. So we'll select our button, head into prototype mode. We're going to add an interaction just like normal on click, only now we're going to select set variable. And Figma's automatically going to bring up a list of all of the available variables that we can choose from. You can search or just scroll down and select is visible. And this is where we're going to write our expression. So what do we actually want to do with this variable? If it's a Boolean, then it's pretty simple. We're just going to change it from true to false. So let's spin up our prototype mode by hitting Shift Enter. We can click and ta-da, it disappears. Now, what happens if we click it again? Well, nothing, because this is actually a pretty simplistic expression right now. We're only saying, hey, when this is clicked, set it to false. But if it's already false, it's not going to set it back to true. So let's add a little bit more logic to this prototype, because actually what we want is we don't want to jump straight to the set variable. We want to do the opposite of the current Boolean state. So let's remove this. And now we're going to add a conditional, because remember, we want to check, is it on or is it off? In natural language, we want to say, if the Boolean is true, set it to false. Otherwise, set it to true. That's kind of how we're going to read this expression here. So if is visible is equal to false, and then we can kind of click out of this and see how now there's another line for an action. So if this condition is true, what do we do? Okay, well, if it's false, we're going to set variable. Remember, everything's going to end in a set variable. So set variable, and we're going to do is visible. And we want to set that because it is false. We want to set it to the opposite, which is true. So now our expression reads, if is visible is false, when this is clicked, set it to true, and then we have an else expression, which we don't actually have to fill in. Sometimes I just leave this blank, but in our case, it's actually really helpful because it's going to allow us to not have to write another conditional from scratch. We can say, if this is false, do this, otherwise, do something else. In this case, the otherwise is a Boolean. So we know the opposite of false is true, and we're going to then have to set it to false. So let's read this back one more time. On click, if our Boolean is visible, is false, then we want to set the variable to true. If it's not false, that means it's true. So the other condition here is we're going to set is visible to false and flip it. So let's go into our prototype, hit Shift Spacebar and see if this works. It hides it. If we click it again, it shows the image. Just like that, you have added your first piece of conditional logic to prototyping in Figma. Pretty cool, right? Now let's look at some other examples so you can start to see what's possible when we use other types of variables. And the first use case I want to take a look at is updating text using variables. And you'll see this often in a couple of different ways. One is tracking the count, or Figma has a lot of examples about tracking the price of something. So in this example up here, I am tracking how many buddies have been selected. And if we go into the design panel, you can see I've bound buddy count to this piece of text. And another example that you'll see a lot of that I find really valuable is some kind of a status message. Think about how often we use those in our designs, and it doesn't really make sense to create an entirely new frame just to show a single piece of text changing. So what we can do is map something like this in the oven. I had Domino's for dinner last night, so this is the example that came to mind. And we can take this and map it to something like the order status. And the thing that I want you to notice about these two examples is normally when we were designing in Figma, we'd probably just write this as a single text layer and then change the styling. But with variables, we have to isolate the part of the text that we want to bind to that variable. So up here, I have a totally separate text layer for this first part, and that is what I've bound to buddy count. And then the rest of this, I don't actually have it mapping to a variable at all because it stays consistent. And the same thing down here, I have two separate text layers, and only this one on the right is bound to the order status. So in these examples, this piece of text is actually being controlled by the local variable. So if I head into my playground here, you'll see that I have order status, and this is set to in the oven. But if I change this to on the way, it's automatically going to reflect in my designs below because this piece of text is directly pulling from this variable. And whatever I have in this value column is what's going to show by default in my UI. Now, the second use case that I want to talk about is updating a component state with variables. And I think this is my favorite use case because we're so often duplicating frames just to show an individual component changing the state across our prototype. So this is a really great way to simplify our prototypes. And the two variables that you're pretty much always going to be using are Boolean variables and string variables. And you might be wondering, well, how do I know which one to use? I'm glad you asked because this actually took me a while to wrap my head around, but once you get it, it's actually really, really simple. If you are updating a component that only has two variants, then you can set these component properties to a Boolean. You can see it's set to true and false. And then you can bind a Boolean variable to an instance of this component and trigger those two component properties with this Boolean right here. But what if we add a third variant? So in this example, I have not started, in progress, and ready. Now the Boolean's not going to map anymore to these component properties. So instead, what we use every time is a string variable. And the most important thing to remember to get this to work is the name of the string that you are typing in the variables and using in your prototype interactions has to map one-to-one to the names of the component properties. So if we look here, I have component properties for not started, ready, and in progress. And the default value that I'm assigning to this component is not started. But if I wanted to change to in progress in my prototype interactions, I would have to write the name of the component property exactly in order for it to work. And I'll just illustrate a really quick example. So this component here is card text variable. I'm going to go ahead and insert that really quickly. And then with that instance selected, I can come to the component properties, hit this little variable icon where it says assign variable. That's how you're going to bind my string variable to the instance of this component. So if I click this button, now I can search for the name of my variable. In this case, I've called it card state, and you can see the default value is not started. So when I do that, nothing's going to change because that default value stays the same. But let's just run a quick test. I'm not going to get into the prototype interactions for this lesson. We'll do that a little bit later, but I want to make sure we can see how it's working. So right here, card state is mapped to not started. But if I change this to something like ready, you can see it's automatically going to update the component below. But if I type something like in progress without a space, nothing's going to happen because that's not exactly how I wrote it with my component properties. Once I add that space though, you'll see, boom, the state of this component is going to change. These changes are going to be done in the prototype interactions, but for the purposes of this lesson, I wanted you to be able to see how they're connected and how you can control any number of variants just by writing the name of the component property just like that. So before moving on, I'm going to summarize this slide really quickly because I think it's one of the most important ones. If you want to update the state of a component, you're either going to be using a Boolean variable or a string variable. If there's only two variants, just use a Boolean. If there is more than two variants, then you will use a string variable and you will simply write the name of the component property that you want to trigger. And don't worry, I'm going to walk you in detail through this specific example in a couple lessons. First, I just wanted to give you the high level overview so you can kind of get a sense for how variables work. Now let's move on to the next use case, and that is updating the styling of a UI element. And the way that you're going to do this is mostly by using color or number. And this first example is all about the color. I've made a little hypothetical email editor here where users can come in and select the theme, and that's going to update the color of the primary button below. So if we open up a prototype by hitting Shift Enter, I'm going to drag this out. And you can see all I have to do is click this button and it's automatically going to change my button below. And the way that you do that is pretty simple. The only catch is you're not going to be able to use one of the variables that's imported from a library. You can alias it as a default value, but we need to have some kind of a local variable that we can change in this prototype interaction. Now you can see in this example, I have created a new variable called UI color, and I just went into local variables, created a new color here, and I'm actually aliasing my BlackBerry 200, which is something that I'm importing from a style guide. You don't have to, you can just use a normal hex code though. And once you have that set up, the next thing you have to do is bind that variable to a piece of UI. And when you're dealing with color, it works basically the same way when you're interacting with styles. You just click on this square and then you can go to libraries, and that new variable that you created will live up here. Now, once you have that variable created and it's bound to your UI, you can then set up your prototype interactions where you're just going to control it on click. So I have on click, set the variable UI color, and then I'm just adding my hex code from my style guide like so. So that's the first way we might update the style of something, is using color variables, but we can also use number variables as well. Because remember, we can bind number variables to almost any piece of UI in Figma. It's the same thing as when we were binding our corner radiuses or binding our height values in the UI kit. Only this way, we can actually control those values using prototype mode. So here's a little example that I think is really useful because I've spent so much time creating these redundant mockups just to simulate a progress bar, where with variables, we can bake all of that logic into a component itself. So if I just open up prototype mode so you can kind of see how this works, I can select these in any order, and it's going to control the progress bar. And the width of the bar here is actually being dynamically calculated according to how many tasks are selected. And I'll show you what that looks like. And the last thing is I have some conditional logic where once that third task is completed, my bar actually turns green. So we're not going to get too into the weeds here. I just want to show you quickly how this is working. Quick disclaimer before I open up prototype mode. The first time that I saw this window, I was pretty overwhelmed, I'll be honest. But once you start to really break it down and read it in natural language, it becomes a lot easier to wrap your head around. So if I open this up here, you can see I have quite a few things that are attached to this on-click event. The first thing is I have this tasks done variable, which is just a number, and I'm incrementing it by 1 each time. And I've bound this tasks done variable to this piece of text right here. And that's what's allowing me to actually count up like so. Now, the next thing that you'll notice is if we open this back up, I'm also updating the width of the bar using this bar width variable right here. And this is kind of the main thing that I wanted to show in this example. I don't want to get too lost in the weeds in the entire interaction. The point is that if we really quickly pop into here, I have the done bar, and I need to show or hide that based off of the number of tasks completed. And for that, I'm just using a Boolean, which we'll look at in a second. But the really interesting thing is I've actually come in here and I've bound the width to this variable bar width. And that's what's going to allow me to dynamically change the progress bar according to how many tasks are completed. So if we go one more time, back in here, you can see when this unchecked item is clicked, I am setting the variable bar width, and I'm setting it to a mathematical expression. I'm saying the bar width is the max width of the bar. So in this case, I've just set the width to 320 pixels times, and then I'm just taking the number of tasks done and dividing it by the total tasks. And so that first time it's clicked, it's basically just 1/3 of the container. It might look intimidating. All this is really saying is 1/3 of the container, and then 2/3, and then 3/3. And that's a pretty powerful thing that we can do with variables. And it's all done by me just saying, you know what? I want to change the width of the bar when this is clicked. So the first thing that I would then do is, okay, I need a variable to control. Then the second thing I do is, okay, I need to bind that to my actual progress bar so I can control it. And now I'm just coming into this prototype panel and saying, okay, how would I control the width of that bar? Okay, so every time this item is clicked, and then it's leading me to, okay, I just need it to be 1/3, 2/3, 3/3. And what you'll realize by doing that math part is that, okay, I need a couple more variables. I need that denominator, the total tasks. In this case, it's just 3. And then I need some kind of a parent width value that I can multiply against. In this case, I've just arbitrarily set 320 pixels because that's what I wanted to use for my UI. Again, don't feel bad if you're looking at this and you're like, I think I kind of get it, but like not really totally. And honestly, it's a little bit overwhelming because I was right there. I promise I was right there. This part really kind of scared me the first time that I got in there and started cracking open these lists and looking at all of the if then and conditional logic. But the more that you practice, the more that you kind of walk through this process, the simpler and more intuitive it's going to become. Because again, at the end of the day, it really is just these 4 steps over and over and over again. You ask yourself, what piece of UI do I want to control? Okay, now we'll create a variable for it. And depending on what you want to do, that determines the variable type. Then from there, you just bind that variable to the piece of UI. And it depends, again, on what type of variable you want to do. It might be in the corner radius slot, or it might be in the typography box, or it might be on that visibility icon because you're using a Boolean variable. Once you have it bound, I'm a big fan of step number 3, which is just test the connection. Can you open up this local variables and make a change to the default value and actually have it impact the UI? If yes, then perfect. Everything is set up correctly. Then the last step is to just set up those triggers where everything is ultimately going to end in at least one set variable. The question is, how many of those do you need? And then do you have to make sure that a condition is met where you actually need to wrap that set variable action in a larger conditional statement? The more you start playing around with variables, the more you're going to realize that this process is so repeatable. You're going to do it again and again and again. And there probably will be a few headaches and gotchas along the way. But the more that you put it to practice, the more intuitive it becomes. And hopefully this video gives you that high level overview that can make it all a little bit less scary.